Let's talk about the natural rate of interest, sometimes also called the equilibrium real rate of interest, that is developed in the beginning of chapter 13 of Mishkin. So recall we have our IS curve that is a relationship between the real rate of interest and GDP. And let's imagine that we mark on our axis where we're measuring GDP, we mark the potential level of GDP, or the full employment level of GDP. So given our IS curve, which remember is determined by the components of planned expenditure, so whatever those components are, the exogenous consumption spending, marginal propensity to consume, government spending, investment spending. So those determine then where the IS curve is, and then wherever that IS curve intersects the potential level of GDP, we'll say that that's the real interest rate that corresponds to GDP being equal to potential, and that's where planned expenditures are being satisfied. And what the real interest rate is doing, we can think of it as the real interest rate is determining how much of the output that we produce is going into current consumption and government spending, and how much of it is going into the savings, aggregate savings at the national level in terms of the potential to consume more in the future. And there's two ways to save in aggregate. One way is to make an investment. Planting a mango tree now will generate mangoes in the future. So you give up eating the mango now because you're going to plant it in order to get more mangoes in the future. So investment is one way to save, and the other way to save is to have positive net exports, to ship goods and services abroad, and that enables you to obtain or build up claims on consumption abroad. So you can produce a whole bunch of stuff here. If you ship it over abroad, then in the future you'll be able to call those claims in and obtain imports from abroad. So those are the two ways to save, and we can think of the interest rate as being the price, in some sense, between present consumption and future consumption. So if the demand for present consumption goes up, then the price of present consumption will rise. R star will go up. So if the IS curve shifts out to the right, because consumption demand increases or government demand increases, then we get a higher equilibrium or natural rate of interest. If consumption demand falls or government demand falls, so the IS curve shifts to the left, then we have a lower real rate of interest in the economy. People aren't as interested, they don't care very much about consuming in the present, meaning they're willing to save more, and so the interest rate, the real interest rate, then falls. So that's how we think of this real interest rate in terms of the equilibrating investment and savings, remembering though that we have this opportunity to save by exporting, which makes it more complicated. So that's the natural rate of interest. Now we can think a little bit more along those lines. So here's the natural rate of interest being determined here. We can think of policymakers at the Fed having some model of the economy, therefore, and having some idea of, well, our model tells us this is the natural rate of interest, and so then the Fed sets monetary policy. Remember, the Fed determines the location of the monetary policy curve. The Fed sets monetary policy, R bar and lambda, right, the two components of monetary policy, in order to have the inflation rate that they would like to target, currently 2% a year. So they have an idea about what the natural rate of interest might be. It could be 5%, it could be 3%, it could be 2%, it could be 1%. Obviously, in contemporary economic discussions, there's a lot of debate over what the current natural rate of interest is. Some people thinking, well, it's gone to zero, might even be negative, and other people asserting that no, it's still same as our sort of long-run natural rate of interest, 3%, 4%, something like that. So there's always a lot of debate over what the long-run rate of interest is. The strongest evidence that the long-run rate has fallen is that corporations, which carry out the bulk of investment in the U.S. economy, corporations are essentially able to borrow at zero now and have indeed a lot of cash on hand, and yet their investment rates have not gone up. So that suggests that the demand for investment is now quite low in the United States relative to the past, and so the real interest rate has fallen. But that's a little aside. The real interest rate then the Fed takes as given and uses that to determine what the monetary policy should be in order to have the targeted inflation rate. And let me go back one other point here. The real rate of interest, we've talked about it, or this natural rate of interest, we talked about it in the context of kind of a closed economy, but of course we could have an excess of imports. That is, if the rest of the world, in particular, say China and Asia, if they're really interested in saving, then the global real rate of interest is going to be low, and so our domestic natural rate of interest then will be lower. So we can think of the natural rate of interest, it's really set at a global level. Global savings has to equal global investment, and the natural rate of interest is the rate where global savings equals global investment. Because we do live in a world now where there's pretty free flows of capital and goods around the world, so it makes more sense to think of it as a global market.